agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Payne.
Hello and welcome to Focus on Liberia on this bright and beautiful Saturday evening. This is the Liberia History channel with our presenter called the name can give me a hard time. Anyway, if those of us from the Guinea Manor, you're welcome. We say Kanu Yola. Welcome to stay. All right, I want to welcome all our viewers from across the globe. This is Focus on Liberia. We are on a series, The Presidents of Liberia. And tonight we're going to be talking about President Daniel B. Warner. That's President Daniel Bashiel Warner. And I want to welcome my presenter here, Yeye Call. Welcome to the show.
It's called how's it been? You enjoy your weekend, Dennis?
It's good. It's been a quiet weekend on this Saturday, but I'm so happy that last week I was off and I'm back to continue with President Warner. You know, I saw the grave and the school is right near when I'm passing to get to Morava College is right there, and I still can picture that school in this picture. So welcome. Let's talk about Daniel B. Warner.
Yes, let's talk about him. So when I was preparing for this presentation, one of the things that struck me was I didn't realize that he was misidentified by more recent historians. And I'm not sure if that's intentional, but there's a habit, I think, throughout Liberian history where former presidents are presented in a way that they shouldn't be. There's two things that I've noticed quite often with Liberian history. One is this intentional, systematic erasure of recaptured Africans. Recaptured Africans.
Before you continue, I want you to underline that word. You said intentional, and we'll come back to it. Why you think it's intentional? So continue.
Yeah, I want to. Yes, of course. So I want to first define who recaptured Africans are. Recaptured Africans are what used to be called Congo people. So the recaptured Africans are the people who were taken into slavery during a period when, after 1808, when the transatlantic slave trade had been abolished. Slavery was still in effect in the United States and other countries, but the transatlantic slave trade had been abolished. And so these people were from places like the Congo Basin, the Niger Delta region. They had been taken into slavery from, Galenas, which is in Sierra Leone today, from, all over the place where they had been captured unlawfully. These people, when arriving, if they were able to prove that they were born free in Africa, they would be released through a form of like a tribunal. And so they created this idea to repatriate these people to Sierra Leone first, and then later Liberia. Most of the reason Liberia exists today is because of recaptured Africans. It was the U.S. government that sponsored to return recaptured Africans. Majority of those that were repatriated to Liberia were recaptured Africans and not actual African Americans, as most people think. While there were many, many African Americans who were repatriated, the recaptured Africans outnumbered them 3-1. This is very important. And these were not only recaptured Africans that arrived in the United States, but some who were rescued at sea, and others who were actually rescued within the Liberian territory as they destroyed slave factories. So there's recaptured Africans who are essentially ethnically Liberian, meaning they're indigenous to the area. So this is very important for us to understand. But for some reason, when you get past 1906, 1908, 1909, you start to see less and less of mention of these people, and there's kind of like an erasure of their existence. They become homogenized with the immigrant African Americans, and their legacy is somewhat lost.
And Cole, I told you to underline that word. You said that erasure was intentional. Why so?
Yes, it has to be. It absolutely has to be. There's absolutely no way that anyone reading Liberian history would not be aware of the prominence of recaptured Africans. Benjamin J.K. Anderson refers to them as Congos. Even as late as 1926 Harvard expedition, in the journals, you hear them talking about the Congos and Congo Town, and they still, as late as the 1920s, were a very distinct, separate group from the repatriated African Americans. So it's very, kind of, it has to be intentional because it's just there were too many of us, too prominent.
But what could be responsible for that?
I think when people have an agenda, we'll get into it. I'm not going to say what could be responsible. I do know that Liberia, after the Berlin Conference, represented a beacon of hope for anti-colonialism after the Berlin Conference when they decided to colonize Africa. And so they needed to create an idea in the minds of Africans and the rest of the continent that these people on this little island country, it's not an island, but this little coastal country, were different from other Africans. They had to paint this picture that these people were a group of mulattoes from America and that their fathers were white men, and that's why they're free. The same thing they did with Ethiopia. They tried to distinguish Ethiopia from the rest of the continent. Even when they fought and defeated Italy, they still, painted Ethiopians as white Africans. They're not like the rest of you. The rest of you deserve subjugation. The rest of you are incapable of self-governance. And so I think that there was an agenda that was being pushed by the colonial movement to erase the Africanness of Liberian leadership.
And I'm also thinking, being someone who grew up in Liberia, born and raised there, that there was sometimes a conscious effort for us to adapt, to be quote unquote settlers, right? So we took on the name. So could it be that Africans or recaptured Africans will want to be seen as people who came from America? Could that be so?
So I do have the earliest example we talked about 2 weeks ago when we did the Stephen Allen Benson. We talked about the Regina Cooley, where the king at Cape Mount sold recaptured Africans back into slavery. They had already been somewhat anglicized, meaning they had learned to speak English a little bit. Some of them could read and write at a very minimal level, because one of the first things they would do when they brought these people in is they would start to try to educate them in English, teach them English and make them try to acculturate them and, of course, baptize them and Christianize them. So when they were captured, they claimed to be Americans. And so this was a very interesting, for me, it was the first example of recaptured Africans claiming to be American. Because they had these Western names, but they could tell that they were not American because many of them had the scarification that you see commonplace in, the Congo Basin, what is now Nigeria, the Niger Delta area. You see the facial scars. So a lot of them, couldn't get away with pretending to be American. But it was mostly, that was my first example of it. Also, indigenous Liberians that were incorporated into the settlement early, when they became Christian and became baptized, they tended to sever their ties with their homes and their extended families that they knew in childhood.
Right. And Vivian Powerhouse call Koma, but I will answer for you because my man come from Bosu. So Vivian, what are second your meaning we tell God thank you. All right. The next question I was asking, Cole, before we get into our topic today, because you said the recaptured Africans, that's the reason Liberia exists today.
That's the reason for the U.S. government getting involved. So there was twofold. We've discussed this in many episodes previously. We talked about the heirs being the U.S. agent for recaptured Africans, and then you also had the ACS, which was for repatriating African Americans. So you had a dual mission with the establishment of the colony, not the republic, but the colony, was to repatriate freed people who were enslaved after the act to abolish the transatlantic slave trade.
Okay, yeah, and this was hey, if you do this thing, we're going to give you some money. So ACS so that was this is profitable, man. We can get some bucks. So tonight we want to welcome again our viewers. We're going to be talking about the presidents of Liberia, and today is the third president of Liberia. So I want to test my skill of doing this, the list of that I learned all the way, in first grade. And so if you can do this list with me, or how we did it, reciting the names of the president, please join me. I'm going to put it on the screen to help you. Let's go. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Stephen A. Benson, Daniel B. Warner, Jane X. Spin, Edward J. Raw, James K. Smith, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, James Briggs Payne, Anthony W. Gardner, Alfred F. Rosa, Hillary R. W. Johnson, Joseph J. Cheeseman, William D. Coleman, Garrison W. Gibson, and Arthur Barkley, Daniel E. Howard, Charles D. King, Edwin Barkley, William V. S. Tubman, and William R. Turbot. So at the time I was in first grade, we stopped with William R. Turbot. Now we continue Samuel K. Doe, Charles G. Taylor, Moses Black, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and Josh Manning Weir. If you were there following along and stamping your feet, I would say congratulations. If you have forgotten, please visit our page and do it again. So, Carl, how you like the rhythm?
I love it. I love it. That's a great way to teach kids to memorize is with song and that kind of thing. I do that with my kids too.
Thank you. Now we're going to go into our topic today, which is Daniel Bashiel Warner, 1815 to 1880. He was the third president of Liberia. His presidency from January 4, 1864 to January 6, 1868. And we got this from Thomas H.B. History of Liberia. That's written by Thomas Walker. Carl.
Yes.
Daniel B. Warner.
Yes. Before I begin, I hope my beautiful niece, baby D, Diana Shaw, is watching. These programs, I really do these for young people. I really do these to excite the generation, that the up and coming generation about Liberia, and to give them what we were not given, which is the sense of pride in our history. A lot of this was buried, really, from us, and we had to search really hard to resurrect the memory of these giants that created a pathway to freedom for not only Liberians but for the African continent. So, Baby D, I hope you're watching, and I'm doing this episode for you and your friends and all the young people in Liberia, and so on. So, Mr. Warner.
I want to note that. Thank you very much for saying that. That we continue to get calls and people say, keep doing what you're doing. Our kids are listening. And so, yes, please watch the show. And for all the young people and even the older people, I always admit that the recitation I just did, we didn't really go beyond that. So this is very beneficial for all of us Liberians to learn about our presidents and see who were these people, what was their actual life, where they came from, were they real human beings, what would their life look like, and then we come to their presidency. Being under President Daniel B. Warner, what was it like? Who was he? What are some of the things he did as president? So I'm excited. I'm all ears. Let's get into it.
Awesome. Well, one of the things I want to point out is this photo. This is a copy of a photo that was published in a book. So it's an actual photograph of President Warner that was published in a book before the photograph was destroyed and remastered. So this photo is very rarely seen. It's very difficult to find this picture. In fact, if you Google Daniel Bashiel Warner, you won't see this photograph. Because it's really not in the public domain like that. But I was lucky enough, with the help of the History Guild, we were able to find this what Warner looked like before his photo restoration. Many of those photographs are so old that they were damaged, and so artists would have to come in and fill in where, you know, there was damage. The same thing was done with Stephen Allen Benson's photo, but in this case, Daniel Bashard Warner's photo must have been far more damaged than Stephen Allen Benson's photo, because if you look at this and you look at what you see on the internet, it's not the same, right? But this is what he actually looked like.
Corey, it's important that you said that because I haven't seen this photo.
Most
the photo
people
that I see is like a white person or mixed.
Not white. They don't really make him white, but they make him look like he's, you know, he doesn't look like this. We'll get into it a little bit later. But Daniel Bashiel, which is a very bizarre name, Bashiel, okay? Bashiel, I believe from my research, this is again just a thought that I'm going to follow up on, but I believe his parents named him Bashir. And I believe that Daniel Warner is something that he obtained from the church. But we'll get into that a little bit more. He was born around 1815. He left this world in 1880. He was the third president of Liberia. He was inaugurated on the 4th of January, 1864, and left office January 6, 1868. Now, the source of this copy of the photo, again, this photo was published in this book called The History of Liberia by Thomas H.B. Walker. He published the photo before the original photo was destroyed. So this is what President Warner actually looked like.
Why was this photo destroyed? We'll get into that.
Bad keeping, you know, supposedly these pictures were not kept well, and there was, you know, just they're old. I mean, you're talking about a man who died in 1880. He was probably photographed around 1865, like the rest of them, right? So you've got pictures. This is it was a very old photograph, and you know, I don't really know. The Library of Congress has the damaged photos in their archives. So artists will look at those and try to, you know, complete the photo. You'll see that towards the end of the presentation, what they've done.
Okay.
Yes. And so he was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1815. His parents were liberated from slavery, according to the church records. There is no court record of his emancipation. So there's the emancipation of his father or his mother or anyone with the name Warner from the year 1870 to the year 1815 in the state of Maryland or Virginia. So this is important. Whenever this happens and you talk about the word liberated and not emancipated, it points towards something. Liberated and not emancipated. So to be liberated, so I made a couple of bullets here. So emancipate is really a legal term of transfer of ownership, or someone who is the custodian of someone, the legal owner, has legal possession of someone. They then either release the person to their own sovereignty or to, you know, some other ward. And his parents were not emancipated from slavery. They were liberated, which means set free. Interesting choice of words.
Yeah.
From this primary source.
Yeah, let's go over the two again. Liberated and emancipated.
Yes. So to be liberated is to be set free, and to be emancipated is a legal transfer of deed and title, which is done through a court. So when human beings were owned in the United States, when African people were owned in the United States, and they were the legal property of another person. That person could release that person to freedom through a process of emancipation that was done through court. And they would basically surrender the deed or title to that other human being. So that was a legal process. This does not exist for Warner's parents, mainly his father. And the reason is usually because they would have been some form of recaptured people, Africans who were brought in illegally and then liberated as opposed to emancipated, because it was able to be proven that they were born free, that they were not born into slavery, but possibly taken into slavery illegally.
That's very important. You know, I was, because I come from an African background where I've been in war, so liberated, I thought people went there and just maybe fought for their freedom.
In a sense, they did. I mean, they would have to go to tribunal, and a lot of times their captors, the people who had them on the ship, would lie and say, no, they're not from Africa, that we got these guys from Jamaica or Brazil, because it was still legal to trade within the hemisphere. You could go from one country to another. You just could not cross the Atlantic from Africa with human beings. So a lot of people, when they come from Africa, the slave traders would get caught and they would lie and say, oh, no, no, these are people from Cuba, or they're from some other island within the hemisphere, because that form of exchange of human chattel was still legal. You could still sell people in between islands and, you know, between the United States and South America, and you could still do that, but you could not bring people who were born free in Africa into the Western Hemisphere after 1808.
That's interesting. So we see Daniel B. Warner coming to Liberia now.
Yeah, let me just go back, please.
Okay.
So this is an important part. So the act prohibiting the importation of human beings, enslaved human beings, was 1807. It was enacted March 2nd, 1808 by the U.S. government, and it took effect January 1, 1808. So anyone entering after 1808, you had an argument to defend yourself and say, hey, I was born a free human being on the continent of Africa. I was illegally subjected to slavery. So Maryland, where he was born, did not actually abolish slavery until 1864. So he was already president of Liberia when the place he was born abolished slavery.
Oh, wow. That is interesting. During the week, I saw on TikTok a video where this African American said, do you think Obama was the first president? Said no. Here are presidents, you know, and he started from Joseph Jenkins Roberts. And first when he said it, I was looking to see American president. And then he started listing, you know, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Stephen A. Benson, Daniel B. Warner. So now saying that at a time he was president of Liberia, you know, back home where he was born, slavery is still legal.
Yeah. So I wanted to point that out. We can go to the next slide.
Yeah, that's very interesting, you know.
So basically, he went to Liberia in 1823 on the Oswego, which was the name of the ship, the Briggs Oswego. It sailed from Baltimore on the 16th of April and arrived at Cape Mesurado on the 24th of May in the year 1823. When the Briggs Oswego arrived, it had taken the total number of people. It had 61 people, one person passed away, so it arrived with 60 people on board. And it brought the total number of immigrants at the settlement, this is in 1823, to 190 people. So the Briggs Oswego brought the total number of people to 190. Is that something of interest? Because, you know, most
because up to we're talking about 18.
This is 1823.
1823.
So the Brig Oswego is the fourth ship
Right.
to sail from the United States with recaptured Africans and African Americans.
And in 1823, still 190. That looked very
And it
small
was
to me.
the fourth ship. So
Excuse
we
me?
have the Elizabeth and the Nautilus, which
Right.
both arrived in what is now Sierra Leone. Those two ships never made it to Cape Mesurado.
Okay, yeah.
They were transferred to Cape Mesurado. The people who were there were transferred to Cape Mesurado in 1822. So the Brig Strong was the first to arrive at Cape Mesurado directly to what is now Liberia. And then the Brig Oswego, which had Daniel Burchard Warner, 9-year-old Daniel Burchard Warner on board. That arrived in 1823. And so of all the four ships, only 190 people, recaptured Africans and African Americans combined, at the settlement at Cape Mesurado.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That number is very small.
Yes, we've talked about death toll, especially with the first two vessels. And then desertion, people leaving and wanting to remain in Sierra Leone and wanting to be in Freetown instead of going onward to Cape Mesurado. So that's important to note. The other thing is, this is a little graph of, a little spreadsheet, of the Warner clan, the extended Warner family. Jacob Warner.
The name, their ages, where they came from, whether they were born free or otherwise, where they went.
They said he was liberated. Jacob Warner, the manifest records also say he was born free. So if you're born free and you're liberated and not emancipated, it points to something.
Recaptured, maybe.
Most likely, because there's zero record of him being, this country, the United States, keeps very meticulous records, especially of property. The reason you can trace slaves so well in the United States is because they were property. You can trace land deeds, you can trace deeds to human beings. And because human beings had a tendency to run away, they kept very meticulous records of who was where and who owned them and where they belonged. There's no record of a Jacob Warner, and I've searched thoroughly, wide range of years. Jacob, so this family unit could have been the ages make sense to me. They could have been a legitimate family. Some of these could have been also orphan children that they took in.
Yeah.
And said, okay, we're going to raise these kids as our own. That happened a lot. You find a wife, there's a lot of children, they were in the church. And so there would have been, okay, since you're married, here are some orphans, you all take them in. So Jacob had this entire family of people that he brought with him to Liberia. We talked about death toll. In 1823, a 4-year-old whose first name is not mentioned died of fever. So he got fever, most likely malaria was a common killer, and nobody really knew what malaria was in 1823. They just would call it fever. We talked about consumption. So in also 1823, John Warner drowned. And John Warner was very close to Eli Ayers. But he drowned that same, really upon arrival, not too long after they arrived.
Right. Because from this list, it means all of them arrived in Liberia. So 1823, meaning they died the same year.
Okay, let me back up a little bit. This is the ship manifest, right? So I'm talking about the Brig Oswego slave sailing from Maryland. And when it arrived, so everything here is the ship manifest. This is the ship manifest of just this family.
Right.
So it's not all the people on the Brig Oswego, it's just the Warners, just Daniel's family.
What I mean is from this manifest, we know that all of them arrived safely in Monrovia or Cape Mesurado.
Yes.
So drowning happened because first when I saw drowning, it's like, oh, did they drown en route to Liberia?
No,
Or
he
they drowned when they got there?
23 at Cape Meserado. There's a whole story about how he drowned, and Eli
Yeah.
writes this excruciating letter. He was very close to John Warner. When he drowned, it traumatized him, and he referred to John Warner as a recaptured African. But there's a whole story about that.
Yeah.
So he did refer to John Warner as a recaptured African in Ayer's book. His memoirs. He talks a lot about how traumatic that was for him, what a loss it was. So Susan Warner, the wife of Daniel's father, she died of an unknown cause in 1831. Abraham Warner was a casualty of war, meaning he was probably shot, in some exchange with indigenous people. And he was 15 years old when he arrived in 1823. So he would have been about 21 when he died in 1829, when he was shot and killed. And then Mary Warner, 1840, she dies of consumption, which is basically tuberculosis.
Oh, I thought that was food poisoning.
No, we
Consumption.
talked about it last time, right? Consumption is really what they used to call TB. And then Daniel's father lived until 1836. So, many of his relatives didn't live very long. So Daniel was still basically a child when his parents died in 1831 and 1836.
Wow.
He was a teenager when his father died, and he was a child. So, and he lost, these other relatives. So we can go into that. I just wanted to point that out, that, the kind of devastation that happened to Stephen Allen Benson, Daniel Bashard Warner experienced the same thing. And he and Stephen were about the same age, but Benson arrived before he did.
Right. So now we have 3 family members: Susan Warner, Daniel, and Matilda.
Yes.
The rest passed away.
Yes.
This is still from the manifesto, I believe.
No, this is now a census from 1845.
Okay. Oh yeah, census.
Yeah. So so this for the manifest, and then the update from the manifest, that went all the way to 1840. So by 1845, his other siblings are also gone.
Wow.
So Daniel's really alone. He doesn't have any family. One of his siblings leaves a child, Alexander White, who was 3 years old. So Alexander White was Daniel Warner's nephew.
Okay.
And when Daniel was 28 years old, he's raising his nephew, and he's got his wife, Rachel, and there's these children listed. There's Theodore Warner, Moses Warner, and John Warner. So his sister's child is 3, Alexander White, and then he has a person who's named as a servant. Her name is Polly Anderson, and she's 18 years old. So Daniel Bashard Warner has 3 boys: his nephew, his 25-year-old wife, who's 28 years old, and he also has Polly Anderson, who is helping him raise his family. A young teenage woman who's helping his wife. So this is important, because between the manifest and the census, you realize that now he's alone, but he has his family. I mean, he's alone. Yeah. He's not with the original people he traveled with.
And in that census, we can't find the names of those original people anywhere.
They're gone. His sister, everybody's gone.
Oh, wow.
And that's why he's raising his nephew.
Yeah.
So there was
Because
Susan, and there was Matilda. I'm not sure if that was Susan or Matilda's child, but he ends up raising this 3-year-old as his son. So Daniel basically raises 4 boys.
yes, Theodore, Moses, John,
And Alexander.
Alexander.
Alexander White. So you see what this whole process of adoption is happening all the time. People losing their parents, people being orphans, people losing their children and looking for other children to bring up and things like that. So the mortality rate was very high.
Right. Call, some questions are coming already.
Okay, we can pause and answer.
Yeah, when you said these people are gone, you say gone where? They died, or Alfred? We were talking about the siblings of Daniel. So
Yeah,
Alfred is
maybe I should be
asking,
more. Yeah.
yeah. And Eddie is asking for the source. Who are the authors of some of the sources?
The source for what exactly? For the list?
Yeah, the list and the information you're presenting.
Okay, so I haven't really quoted anyone specifically yet. What I'm providing so far is primary source documentation, ACS records, American Colonization Society records from the time period. So this is not like a book. These are records.
Right, and I think when you say source now, so these are primary sources.
Yes.
And where the primary source come from? Maybe if you
So the
can
American
clarify.
Colonization Society, you've got when I was talking about liberated from slavery, that was from the Methodist Church, I'm sorry, not the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church. There's also Methodist Church records I'm going to get into in a little bit. But right now, if you're specifically asking about the records for the ship manifest, that's the American Colonization Society and the U.S. government.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's exactly what primary source is.
Right.
Soon after his arrival, Daniel was placed at a school of a better class than that in which he had acquired the rudiments of education in Baltimore. Among his instructors were George R. McGill and the Reverend John Roxy. He was also classmates with Stephen Allen Benson.
Yes.
As a young man, Warner made several trips for trading purposes along the Liberian seaboard. This employment seems to have given him a taste for navigation, but the scarcity of vessels was then a formidable obstacle.
Yes. So let's talk about, so what I really appreciate about this early time period is the emphasis on education. They didn't take this thing lightly. They were very, very serious about making sure that the young people in the settlement learned how to read, write, think critically, and be able to solve problems. So Stephen Allen Benson, as you know, we talked about last time, had been in the captivity of King Peter Bromley of the Day people, who we know as King Peter. King Peter Bromley kept Stephen Allen Benson for an unspecified period of time, or a disputed period of time. Some people say it was months, others say it was years. I believe it was years. When he came back, he became close to Daniel Bashiel Warner because Daniel was so clever in school. And Stephen, having been away doing more traditional education among the indigenous people, when he came to school and he met Daniel, Daniel was almost like his tutor and mentor. They were born about a year apart. And so Warner was an absolute multi-genius. His ability to solve problems and educate himself and give himself skills was really extraordinary. I mean, we don't even have this level of genius commonly today, where people have all the opportunities and access to information. I mean, he had this huge family to support. So he started going on these trips. What used to happen is what they called the crew boys or crewmen, which were members of the plow or crew. Grable, Bassa ethnic group used to hire themselves on ships and engage in trade or help the ship captains with manual labor, sometimes even cross the Atlantic.
Before we go ahead, because what you mentioned about Stephen Allen Benson, being captured, now he's back, and we see him connected to Daniel B. Warner, who is a very smart student in class, and it's important to that you mentioned that, because I'm thinking also that the teacher may have had some role to play in that. Looking at this student who is probably just coming to school and say, hey, this is a bright student, let's pair this for peer tutoring, right? Because there are some teachers who can spot people like that and say, hey, we want to get these two together. Teachers those days were very much concerned, about the students, even outside of school.
Yes.
And so it might be responsible for this.
Yeah, that was a very common practice in the very early stages. Even when Lot Carey opened his school in 1822 for indigenous and indigenous children and recaptured children, one of the things he did is once one of them learned something, he would have them be like a head of the class to teach the other kids, because that child understood the language. So if there was a child who spoke the Malinka language, and there were more Malinka children who would come to the school, what he would, or he would have those children who had now learned English be the ones to help to teach the others.
Yeah.
That was a common practice.
Good.
Not that Stephen Allen Benson couldn't speak English, but what I meant is the tutoring, the class tutor thing was a common practice.
Right. Yeah. From my teacher background, we say peer tutoring, right? So we put students together who can help other students come up. So continue with that, the Grable, all these crewmen.
So Warner took after these the crewmen and was like, oh, this is a way for me to hustle and make some money. I can get on these ships, tour the coast, trade, make some money, and come back and support my family. So that's how he started this whole, his obsession, or his fascination, not obsession, his fascination with the whole maritime world, was by sailing the coast. And a lot of times, there was a scarcity, as it says in the slide, there was a scarcity of vessels. So again, this is a problem, and we're talking about a problem solver. That's what Stephen Allen Benson was. He was a thinking person. He was a problem solver. He says, look, we sometimes wait for weeks before we can get a vessel to go to Cape Palmas or any of these other places. So we're going to have to solve this issue. Next slide, please.
So Mr. Warner had no practical acquaintance with shipbuilding. In fact, he had never witnessed the operations of that trade. Moreover, there was no person in the colony who had any knowledge of marine agriculture or architecture. These difficulties would have been enough to discourage any ordinary projector, but Mr. Warner, while yet quite a young man, resolved to build several vessels large enough for the coast trade, and was quite successful in this undertaking. He was the first who brought the art of ship or boat building into the settlement. His first two vessels bore the significant names of Experiment and Perseverance. Wait a minute. This kid now building ships?
The man started building ships, and it didn't sink. I mean, the first one, he called it the Experiment. He called his first ship the Experiment, and it did not sink. He reverse engineered a vessel. So you remember the last episode, we were talking about how sometimes these ships would crash on shore, and then the indigenous people would loot the ships. Our ancestors would come and be like, oh, free for all. So he observed these ships. He would look at them, see how they're structured, and he would deconstruct and reconstruct them. So the Experiment was his first vessel that he literally reverse engineered a vessel. And it sailed up and down, servicing the coast, the coastal trade. So if somebody wanted to send goods, there were a lot of agricultural plantations. We're talking about very industrious people. A lot of the indigenous groups from the north were utilizing his vessel, and also a lot of the coastal traders who used to have to wait sometimes for a few weeks to get a vessel. Now you've got the experiment, and then later on he came up with a second boat because there was even too much demand for even just the experiment. So now there's this whole economic bustle because he had this ship. So what he did was he built a second vessel to carry goods. And at that point now there's two ships carrying goods up and down the coast. And so all of these colonies, this is before Liberia was a country, all these independent colonies along the coast are able to trade with each other and also travel, visit each other, exchange ideas, and even relocate to other settlements. So he actually, we talked before about E.J. Roy, having the first transatlantic ship to fly the Liberian flag. This man built the first ships. This is not to discount the idea of the fact that we had, ancient artisanal vessels flying the coast. But their capacity, their load-bearing capacity was not measurable to what Daniel Bashiel wanted it.
Right. So do we actually know whether those were like boats or
They
ships?
were ships.
Or
they were ships.
Ships.
They were ships. These are vessels. These were ships.
Wow.
So, we're not talking about our artisanal vessels, which were always there and were there for many, many centuries, for millennia. We're talking about, at that time, in that context, modern ships that he was able to reverse engineer and build.
Yeah. So, in 1838, Mr. Warner received the appointment of quartermaster to the troops, which were dispatched under Colonel Joseph Jenkins Roberts to Little Bassa. In 1839, he performed the duties of sailing master of the government schooner Euphrates and assisted in the demolition of the slave factory at Little Bassa. In 1840, he was appointed captain of the government vessel Campbell, but in a short time, he was called to a more responsible position, namely that of collector of customs of the Liberia Commonwealth.
Yes.
We're still talking Daniel here.
Yes. So
quartermaster to the troop. I wonder what that was.
Sorry, say that again.
He was appointed quartermaster to the troops, which were dispatched under Colonel J.J. Roberts to Little Bassa.
Yeah, so Liberia didn't have, these were we talked about this when we talked about Roberts and his militia activities. So he was basically a leader for a group of soldiers. Most of these soldiers at this time would have been recaptured Africans. So the other thing is, it's important, he's now getting into government positions because he's a trader, he's a shipbuilder, he's a transportation guy. Now he gets into becoming a collector for customs. So he's working his way up. And he was not a rich guy. He didn't come, to Liberia with gifts from some emancipating, wealthy person. He wasn't rich, because a lot of these people would be liberated if you were emancipated from a plantation and you're the biological child of the person who's emancipating you. They would often gift you with things to start your life in Liberia. Daniel Bashiel did not have any of these blessings or these easy opportunities. He had to work as if he were a recaptured African, as if he were a crewman or a Grable person or anybody else. He had to struggle and figure out how to work his way up. And it was because he earned this prominence that now he gets to be a customs collector. He gets to help the government regulate and collect taxes. This was huge for him. He was not a member of any kind of elite class by any stretch of the imagination at this time. It was his friend. It was his friend who pulled him up.
Wow. So we continue next slide.
Mm-hmm.
In 1847, and this is the only thing that I know of Daniel B. Warner when I was in school in Liberia. In 1847, he wrote the Liberia national anthem. He became a member of the first legislature of the Republic in 18.
Oh, sorry, it's 1847. I left out the 7. Y'all forgive me.
1847.
Yeah.
And was chosen Speaker of the organization of that body. He filled various other offices of trust and honor in the Republic. He was elected mayor of the city of Monrovia and was twice elected Secretary of State, which office he occupied from 1848 to 1850 and from 1855 to 1858. In 1859 and 1861, the suffrages of the people made him vice president, and in 1863 he was elected to the highest office within the gift of his countrymen.
Yes. Recaptured Africans dominated the population. They were the majority of the citizens, along with indigenous who had been incorporated into the colony. They were more comfortable with Stephen Allen Benson, Daniel Bashiel Warner. They saw themselves in these men. This was the reality of how things were structured in the colony. And when it became a country in 1847, a majority of the citizens were born in Africa.
1847. Wow, this is incredible. And I'm looking twice as Secretary of State.
Yes.
And this is
about this concept where everybody's like, oh, everybody was mulatto and this and that. Oh, the Republicans, the early party of Liberia, the Republicans, were all mulatto. And then they say that, oh, the Truwig, Edward James Roy, was the first Black president. This is absolutely false. We discussed Stephen Allen Benson, who was just as Black as I am, as Black as you and myself, Dennis, just as African as you and myself. And now his not only his vice president becomes president, and Daniel B. Warner is also full-blooded African, contrary to what is said later on. This is important for the reasons that I stated earlier. Something shifted after the Berlin Conference, the partitioning of Africa and the plan for colonization. They needed to discredit Africans, the ability of Africans to self-govern. And they could only do this if they were able to erase Liberia. And of course, this happened after President Warner was gone, had died, excuse me, I use the word gone, after the death of President Warner and the death of E.J. Roy and all of this. So that's important. Let's look at the next slide, please. And this one, I'm not going to make you read all of this. I just wanted to point out something. So this is the African Repository. This is published in 1863.
right.
Here they said Warner. This is in 1863. He was alive. This is a primary source. They saw him. They interacted with him. They said Mr. Warner is of unmixed African blood, born in Baltimore. I'm emphasizing this for a reason. It's Mr. Warner is of unmixed African blood.
Carl, you should adjust your audio there while I read it, because your audio is coming up choppy a little bit.
Okay.
So adjust that while I read. So election of president, and this is from the African Repository. It reads, election of president. At the biannual election in Liberia on Tuesday, May 5th, the Honorable Daniel Bashiel Warner was chosen as president, and the Reverend James M. Priest as vice president of the Republic by large majorities. Their terms of office commenced on the first Monday in next January. The canvass was conducted with much spirit, but more free than usual of party bitterness. Mr. Priest has been a devoted missionary of the Old School Presbyterian Board of Sino, Mr. Warner is of unmixed African blood, born in Baltimore, April 19, 1815, reached Monrovia May 24, 1822, and has now since been out of Liberia. He is a man of integrity and ability, a successful merchant, and has acceptably held several prominent positions, among others that of Secretary of State. He is now serving his second term as Vice President and President of the Senate of the Republic. That's Daniel B. Warner.
This was published before he was elected to president.
Yeah.
But I wanted to point out how they described him.
Unmixed African blood.
Yes. So this is important. I wanted to point this out. And again, he was alive. He was vice president. So you had very, very Black Stephen Allen Benson, who was also pure-blooded African, and Daniel B. Warner, who was his vice president, who was an African. This is important because what they've done to Liberian history in order to justify colonialism is what we have to expose. And they didn't really hide anything. I mean, you know, you have access to things. We just have to do our due diligence. They just made a point not to put it into the curriculum. So when you go to school, it's not going to be in your textbook. It's conveniently omitted. And then they don't put the actual photographs of the founders. They make sure they sketch them and they make them look a little bit different, so that you don't think that that has anything to do with you. Not that it matters. Not that, you know, people who are mulatto are not African. Of course they're African. Of course you're still Black. Of course you're still going to be subject to oppression and racism. Even Joseph Jenkins Roberts, who was, you know, quarter Black, was subject to racism. But the idea is they wanted us to believe everybody was Joseph Jenkins Roberts, so they could attribute their greatness to their white male fathers. And in this case, there was no white male father. How in the world could Daniel Bashiel Warner be mulatto and his father was an African? You see the contradiction. Yeah. You see the it doesn't. There's not even logic to it. It doesn't take much thought to say, why is this? This is strange. Let's dig into this a little bit further.
And I think that's where we fell short, right? Because when we went to school in Liberia, looking at the history, we just, maybe it's me, right? But I think we glossed over these things. There were no deep thought as to say, okay, why is this way? And I know we're going to get to the picture later, but when you see what you show us and what we normally see in the book, the two are different. So if the father is Black, it is beyond impossible that this Black man will have a kid by a white mother, right? So,
and the mother was also on the vessel anyway.
Right.
They're trying to say they're both mulatto people, which is not true. So the reason they're emphasizing him being of unmixed African blood in this is because that was their code word of basically saying, you know, this is American colony. This is before the partition of Africa. This is before colonialism. And the whole point at that time was, before colonialism, the point was self-governance. After colonialism, the paradigm shifts. So they wanted to point out to people that, hey, this guy's a genius and he's fully African. He doesn't have any white ancestors. We're not attributing his genius to Europe. This is an African man.
Well, so the next slide. And Carl, you're going to tell me who's talking here. We've just entered upon another presidential campaign, and we have but little else except politics. Honorable Daniel B. Warner is the candidate on one side, and Honorable B.J. Drayton of Cape Palmas on the other. Both parties seem sanguine of success. Mrs. Roberts joins me in kindest regards to Mrs. Gurley and yourself and all the family. And believe me, my dear sir, your most respectfully, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Monrovia, February 19, 1863.
Yes.
Now I see where it's coming from.
Yeah. So Joseph Jenkins Roberts, this is an excerpt for a letter he wrote, just a part of a letter he wrote to Gurley. And so basically he's just talking to Gurley about the excitement around the election. The overemphasis in Liberian history of this divide between mulattoes and African, pure-blooded Africans is not really supported in the primary source documents. I'm not saying there was no colorism. There's colorism today. People are bleaching their skin today. People, want to have light-skinned babies today. I'm not saying that there was no colorism. What I'm saying, the overemphasis on some mulatto/African war, it's not supported by the record. We had a discussion on here once, and I was saying, listen, the true Whig Republican Party divide or the issue was ideological. It really wasn't about skin color. And many very well educated Liberians attacked me for saying so. Oh, it was about color, it was about color. It wasn't. It was ideological, and I systematically laid out what the ideological differences were between the Republicans and the true Whigs. The true Whig party's mantra, their ideology was radical. They did not want interference, and they did not want they didn't want to be an economic satellite state for the United States and their wealthy elite. They wanted economic freedom and independence. And the Republicans were more conservative and felt that they needed to take their time to pull their heads out of the lion's mouth, to continue to pander to the West in order for their protection. The Republicans felt that if they were to sever those economic ties, if the U.S. didn't have economic interest in Liberia and they didn't economically dominate Liberia, they would risk complete annihilation by the European states who were now colonizing Africa. Whereas on the other side, you have the true Whiggers that were like, no, we're going to fight. We're going to fight these people. We're going to stand up for ourselves. We are men. So E.J. Roy had a confidence, a self-determination, and a radical audacity about himself that some of them did not have. And on the true Whig side were also so-called mulattoes. And on the Republican side, as we've already demonstrated, there were pure-blooded Africans. So it was not just about the color of skin. In fact, that isn't even supported. But to push that narrative, they sketch these people to look like something that they're not. Let's go to the next slide, please. Dennis?
So Cole, who was this her Gurley? Mrs. Gurley.
You've heard of Gurley Street?
Yeah. It said Mrs. Roberts joined me in kindest regards to Mrs. Gurley and yourself.
Yeah, he's writing to former colonial agent, ACS agent Gurley.
And Warner?
I'm sorry?
Oh, okay. So this letter it mentioned Warner, but it's not addressed to Warner. Okay.
No. He's talking about Warner, and he's talking about
right.
He's writing Ralph Randolph Gurley. He's often referred to as R.R. Gurley. That's what Gurley Street is named after.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's writing R.R. Gurley, and I said it's an excerpt from the letter, and he's telling him about the political situation in Liberia.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Priest is his vice president. So Mr. Priest, of course, from Sino County. Again, another very Black man is his running mate.
I wonder why Briggs did not run the next time. But anyway,
We'll get into that with the next one. So you don't have to read all of this. It's more repetition. This one is from the Massachusetts Colonization Society. This was published in 1862 on May 28th. And it began, I underline here, it says, Honorable Daniel Bashiel Warner was chosen. Okay, it says it's basically describing Warner. It says, Mr. Warner, a full Black, and then it goes on to say he was born in Maryland. So Daniel Bashiel Warner, born, again, we started at the beginning, we talked about how his parents were liberated, and he was born about a year later. And he immigrated from Maryland at about 9 years old, arrived in Liberia at about 9 years old. Everyone is emphasizing how Black this man is. They're all referring to him as a pure-blooded African because they knew him.
Right. And this is an example of a primary source document?
Yes.
So this is from the Massachusetts Colonization Society.
Yes.
Their annual report. So it's interesting when we say, oh, Liberia history, right? So when we go digging, we see information on Liberia in these places.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Liberia has a lot of documented history.
Yeah.
A lot of documented history. You just, right. I mean, the primary sources on Liberian history are, I mean, voluminous, various sources, whether it be the colonization societies. Remember, we talked about how many different colonization societies there were. We, you know, before the establishment of the state, these colonization societies continued even after Liberia was established. You talk about U.S. government records. Yeah. We're talking about these people themselves could read and write and documented and kept journals and wrote, you know, memoirs. You're talking, I mean, we have a wealth of information.
Let's go to a few comments here. This one from Sekou Sharif talking about the unmixed African blood reference. Why was it important to highlight this?
I think I've answered that thoroughly. Maybe he wrote that earlier.
Yeah. Let's say that question should be answered by the writers of history. Okay, so that it makes sense. Thanks for the explanation. Sam Wallace said indigenous population was not allowed to vote at this time. Neither were women, correct? Only male settlers could vote, talking about the election of Daniel B. Warner.
Women couldn't vote in the United States or anywhere in the modern state sense. I mean, indigenous people who practice forms of traditional democracy, women had a voice. I mean, in the Zobush, women had a voice. But no, in the modern state, women didn't get suffrage until the 20th century. So as far as indigenous people had their own countries, their own states. There were many, many nations within the Liberian territory. And in those nations that existed within the Liberian territory that practiced a form of democratic process, meaning that they had councils of elders that made decisions. Every citizen was not allowed to make decisions, only the House of the Wives. And in the Liberian state itself, the indigenous people who were incorporated, voluntarily incorporated, those who were rescued from Trade Town, the people who, who sought refuge among the colonists, there were many Malinka people who, the father, for example, of J.J. Dosen, who was a future vice president, who was Madingo Vai. These people were all the first citizens of Liberia, and all of those men could vote. None of the women could vote in Liberia or the United States or France or anywhere until after the women's suffrage movement.
Right. So the short answer to Sam is yes, women did not vote, and only indigenous that were incorporated in the settlement, they voted. That's what you're saying in essence.
Yes. So there were a lot of indigenous in the settlement and recaptured Africans. Right. Males could vote, women and children could not vote. The other thing is, I think there was another. I think he says he wrote. He didn't. He okay. Yeah, he said he wrote it earlier. Good. So he
Yeah.
already has the answer. So yes, it was. It was. It's important in this presentation to emphasize it, just because there's a lot of misinformation about who Daniel was, and
Yeah.
again, a deliberate attempt to whitewash him.
Mohammed Saleh Douglas said, if we could push a different narrative about his color, could Bashiel be a westernized spelling of Bashiel?
Yeah, I talked about that already, Mohammed, and I think you and I talked about this off the record. I am, trying to connect, not trying to connect. I'm trying to see if there's a connection between Daniel Bashiel Warner and a recaptured African woman who gave birth under the custodianship of the Presbyterian Church and named her son Bashir.
I mean, we know he was born in Maryland, right? So
yes,
why is this Bashir or Bashir?
Custodian of these recaptured Africans when the little boy Bashir was born that same year. There right now is absolutely no way for me to connect that child named Bashir to Daniel Bashiel Warner. But those recaptured Africans were likely from, the part of West Africa that we now call Nigeria. And at that time, you had many of these revolts, the old order Muslims of the plateau region of Nigeria, the northern part beyond the plateau, the Hausa and the people from the northern part of Nigeria who had been selling other people into slavery for many centuries. At this point where you have the illegal, so-called illegal slave trade, that is when the rebellion against those people occurred. And you started seeing a lot of Hausa, who were the traditional slave traders, being captured and sold by the united forces of the plateau and coastal people of what is now Nigeria. So it is very possible a lot of these at that time period would have been Hausa and other people like that. So, and people from Oyo and all these other kingdoms. So is Bashiel, is it a misspelling? It's an interesting question. It's something that people need to explore. But thank you, Mohammed, for that question.
Yeah, but I don't even think of that. I don't know why that would be really important. That he was born in Maryland, right?
Yes.
So born free, father was born free. So is it to trace him back to? I mean, definitely the parents came from Africa. So
Right.
why is this Bashir or Bashir? Why is that important?
I think it gives him ethnic identity, right? Because a lot of African Americans, for E.J. Roy, his father told him who he was.
Right.
His father told him who he was and even taught him phrases in his language. But a lot of people born in the United States do not have that connection back. And Daniel himself never said anything about his origins. And what happened a lot of times when these people were baptized and they were stripped of these traditional names, they were told that, you're Christian now. Christians don't carry African names. Yeah. Christians don't speak these languages. I mean, it was crazy how much they would divorce people of their identity in order to give them salvation.
Yeah.
As if God didn't create all human beings. But if you become Christian now, you must be Eurocentric. You can no longer be African in that sense. So once a person is baptized, literally what they were doing and telling them is you are washing yourself of your tradition, of your culture, of your history.
You are born again.
You're born again, and you are no longer, if you were Hausa, you're no longer Hausa.
Yeah.
You're just now your tribe is your ethnicity. I'm sorry, not tribe. Your ethnicity is now Christian. That's now your identity. That is what they did.
As late as when I became Christian, you can't eat cola now because you're Christian.
Right. I mean, it happened right on Liberian soil. It was the same tactic. Exactly. So I wanted to point this out, that this is yet a third source, a third primary source, stating that Mr. Warner was a full-blooded African. So this is overwhelming evidence to prove that this man was black. He was not mixed race, as they call it.
Interesting.
So this is important. This is a quote from Liberia by Sir Harry Hamilton Johnson. Sir Harry Hamilton Johnson was a botanist, a scientist, a cultural anthropologist, and a social Darwinist, which made him an extreme white supremacist and a racist, a very, very racist human being, who he and Stamp Otto uh, created two large volumes of research on Liberia's plants and animals and included the human beings under the category of animals. However, doing so, they took some, we always talk about picking sense out of nonsense. It's an extremely racist piece of work as it relates to human beings. However, it does have extremely valuable scientific information. They collected meticulous data about the plants and animals. But he also was on a mission, um, you know, to dehumanize in his mind. So when he hears about these people, um, he writes things about them that are just not true. I mean, he says in 1860, you could go ahead and read.
In 1864, Stephen Allen Benson, a Negro, had been succeeded as president by Daniel Bashiel Warner, a mulatto, who, being re-elected once, served from 1864 to 1868. Although, like Benson and Roberts, Warner was a Republican or true Liberian candidate, he went over while in office to the Whig Party, to the Whig policy of preserving Liberia jealously from white invasion. He has moved to his distrust of Europeans by the actions of Harris and other merchants, nor can he be held to have been wholly unreasonable in establishing his ports of entry law in 1865. According to his measure, commerce to non-Liberians and any person of African race could become a Liberian citizen, even
Yeah,
blasey, blasey, blasey.
yeah. I stopped it there for a reason because it was just going to go on and on. But here's what's important here. This is the first time. And Warner died in 1880, and this is being written in 1906. It was 26 years later. There's no, well, I shouldn't say there's no way. I don't believe that he didn't know that Daniel Bashiel Warner was a full-blooded Negro or African. I believe this was the propaganda, because now we're talking about the reason Stamp and Otto are in Liberia is to discredit the possibility of African self-governance.
Yeah.
That's all these missions that occurred after this, all these exploration things, all these science. It was to see what kinds of resources were on the ground, who the people were, and also to adamantly discredit African people's ability to govern themselves. So Warner going over to the True Whig Party was upsetting to them. And we talked about the ideological differences. At that time when Warner went over, the issue was, hey, we need, he's using words like Liberia jealously from white invasion. Of course, you have the partitioning of Africa. You have the partitioning of Africa. You have a situation where Africa is being, you have a situation where Africa is being divided by Europe. Liberia is on the continent. They've been attacking the borders from all sides, from all angles at this point. You had the Woslu Empire with Samori Toure trying to protect, draw all of the Mendi people into one big Madingo empire, Malinka empire, excuse me. So you've got Woslu growing, and you've got all of this, and they're fighting Woslu. They're also fighting Liberia. They're fighting Ethiopia across the continent. So this is not jealousy, this is self-preservation.
Yeah.
So Warner and others are like, wait a minute. My entire family died for sovereignty, for this place to remain free. Many of our families died for this place to remain free. They want to come and enslave the indigenous population. That's what they are doing in Congo. That's what they are doing in Southern Africa. That's what they're doing next door in Sierra Leone, in French Guinea. They are destroying traditional systems. So they're trying, so they're pulling together. And here is Harry Hamilton Johnson writing about it as if it's absurd and misclassifying him in order to attribute his genius to some non-existent European father.
Wow.
So, I mean, I don't know if you want to read all of this. This is pretty long, but basically what this is before you, let's see, where are we? Oh, I'm sorry, I was ahead of you. So yeah. So this is supposed to be Stephen Allen Benson and Warner. After this, you've got people writing subsequently. So after this book is published by Johnston and Stomp and Otto Stomp, and they call him a mulatto, all the 20th century, all of the 20th century authors after that refer to him as a mulatto. Now, because Sir Harry Hamilton Johnson has written this big voluminous work on Liberia, that becomes the source, the go-to for all Liberian historians, all authors writing about Liberian politics, everyone writing about Liberia. They are going to reference this voluminous work.
Right.
Because it's easier than going to the primary source. Everything's right there. He went to all these sources and he's got everything already in one place. We're just so everyone after that starts calling the man a mulatto and start presenting a lot of the misinformation that Sir Harry Hamilton Johnson presents in his book.
Wow. Hold on again, Carl. So we go back. Hillary Johnson wrote this and said,
Harry Hamilton Johnson.
Yeah, Harry Johnson wrote this and said, Stephen A. Benson, a Negro, has been succeeded by Daniel B. Warner, a mulatto. So now books coming after that is quoting this one, say, when he had completed his third term, Benson bowed out gracefully to a Republican colleague, Daniel Bashiel Warner, another mulatto, Baltimore born.
Yeah, so this is just a snippet.
Right. So they're saying both Stephen Allen Benson and Daniel B. Warner are all mixed.
That's what he's claiming.
It's a lie.
Now, this picture is just something I put there clearly, but So it's not only him. There's lots of modern authors. I'm not going to call them out. A lot of these guys are still living. You guys can look up their books, but I mean, it's shameful because it was very easy for them to know that this wasn't true. But, so somebody gives misinformation and everybody just starts building upon that. And the lie turns into now they even erase the blackness of Stephen Allen Benson. So now, you've got James Priest, you've got Smith, you've got all these people. Nobody knows that they're black. Nobody knows they're African. Nobody even knows how many indigenous Liberians were in prominent positions, vice president, chief justice, and all these roles before our lifetime, because they were erased. Because they wanted to attribute everything to American, African Americans, who they're trying to say are all mulattoes, and they're able to govern themselves because they're not actually African. They're not really African. They're not African like you, Mr. over there in Ghana, or you over there in Nigeria, or you sitting there in Congo. These people are different from you.
Right. And so, Vivian, you have your answer there. Vivian is saying, why were they changing his photo? Yes, to present a false narrative that actual Black Africans cannot govern themselves unless they are mixed.
Well, so here's the thing. When I first started this podcast, I mean, the first thing I said was the photo in the middle is a replica of the original photo. The photo to the black and white photo is a restoration of the original photo that was damaged. I don't think they did a terrible job, right? Did a pretty decent job. I mean, the haircut is pretty silly. Nobody cut their hair like that in the 1800s, right? So they give him like a fade. So whoever did this was a little silly in that aspect, but he wouldn't have had a fade. It was the 1800s. So you see the black and white photo. So it's clear that that top part of the photograph was damaged and they had to restore it. They digitally remastered it and they created a situation where they gave him a fade. And I think that's just hilarious. But you can see that the eyes are pretty similar between the photo in the center and the photo to the left, right?
Right.
They redid his beard. Maybe that part was damaged. Probably the bottom half of the photo was also damaged. You can see the tie is a little different. So this is a restoration of the black and white photo on the far left is a restoration of a damaged photograph. So I don't know if they were necessarily trying to whiten him in this particular picture, but it seems to me that it was just an attempt to restore something that was damaged. And again, in the center is what he actually looked like. On the right, this is a portrait by a European American named Thomas Sully. He did this in 1864 when when Daniel B. Warner was still alive. And he painted him very, very dark. I don't think it looks like him, but he made him very, very dark, as he was described by everyone.
Wow. Now, therefore, I, Daniel Bashiel Warner, President of the Republic of Liberia, do hereby declare and proclaim to the descendants of Africa throughout the West Indies, who may be desirous to return to their fatherland and assist in building up an African nationality, that the government and people of this republic are anxious to welcome them to these shores. A grant of 25 acres of fresh, fertile land will be made by the government to each family and of 10 acres to each single individual. Persons of all classes and pursuits are invited: mechanics and merchants, school teachers, physicians, ministers, farmers, laborers, etc. The demand in this new and growing country for persons skilled in all professions and in every branch of industry is unlimited. Brethren of the Entiles, we are one in origin and destiny. We have the same history of centuries of suffering, of tribulation and woe. The time seems to have come in the providence of God when this oppressed people, wherever they may be found in their exile, should see together and cooperate for the establishing in the land of their fathers a home and a nationality. The Republic of Liberia, whose independence is acknowledged by all the leading nations in the world, seems to be the most suitable starting point from which the returning exiles may begin to take possession of and civilize this long neglected land, and thus aid in restoring to this ancient cradle of civilization her pristine glory. By the President, given under my hand at the city of Monrovia the first day of March in the year of our Lord 1864, and of the Republic the 17th. Daniel Bashiel Warner, Edward W. Blyden, Secretary of State.
Yeah. So one of my favorite Liberian exiles was Edward Wilmot Blyden. So one of the greatest accomplishments, there were many. I'm not going to drag this show on any longer, but one of the greatest accomplishments of Daniel B. Warner was his effort to build Liberia by seeking out human capital, and also by incorporating as many of the indigenous people that wanted to be part of the state as possible. At that time, Warner was working with, at that time, Warner was basically trying to penetrate the interior, trying to get the indigenous kings, especially in the Northern Territory, because the coastal people were already at that point incorporated, but trying to penetrate into the Northern Territory to encourage them to participate in this republic and be part of the country. And at that time, there was no military might. They couldn't do so by conquest. It had to be through diplomacy and trying to encourage everyone to kind of unite around this concept of a Liberia. And he also wanted to bring more skilled people in, people with the ability to help to advance the cause of the African people and the struggle for freedom. And President Warner saw Liberia as that beacon of hope for the rest of the continent of Africa and for African people scattered throughout the world, meaning the diaspora of the continent, the sons and daughters of enslaved people. So he was a champion for that. It is because of Daniel B. Warner. It is because of Daniel B. Warner that an indigenous man like J.J. Dosen could become vice president. It is because of people like Daniel B. Warner that, Caribbean people like the Barclays could come and reestablish themselves and become prominent figures in the struggle for African liberation. So that is how he saw Liberia. And, the fact that his ethnic identity as an African, period, was tried. They attempted to erase it, and I think it was, based on everything. It was clearly deliberate, because Sir Harry Hamilton Johnston, these are the guys that their work all over the world advised the Nazi movement in Germany. I mean, these are the people. Their work, their so-called work around the world, empowered Nazi Germany. So these are the precursors to Nazis we're talking about here, that came to Liberia and did all of this work and paved the way for the subjugation, further subjugation of African people in the early part of the 20th century.
And what was this document?
What are you talking about?
This document that's on the screen where Daniel B. Warner is saying this.
This is one of his speeches. This is just an excerpt.
Okay, it's a speech.
Asking what the source is?
Yeah, no, this is a speech. That's what I wanted to understand.
Actually, I think this is actually a letter, not a speech. This is a letter that he wrote, and this is like a declaration. So this is captured in the U.S. Congressional records. It is also republished. This letter is also republished in the Evangelical Repository of that same year. And then it is also, I think I also have a copy of the same letter in
because
the African Repository. Yes, the African Repository as well. Because
our colleagues who are doing the bicentennial, I think they should have this. They should read it, right? Because it's kind of reinforcing that this is the home for all the oppressed people. Come home, come here.
Yeah.
So this is something, the document that they can use.
I mean, this is a testament to Liberia being the birth of the Pan-Africanist movement. And because these giants of Pan-African thought and ideology were buried, I mean, these are the people that Marcus Garvey, I mean, it was Daniel B. Warner that opened up the Caribbean to this concept of going back to Africa. And these are the people that Marcus Garvey emulated. This is the reason Marcus Garvey wanted to go to Liberia in the first place. And you have people attributing Pan-Africanism and the Back to Africa movement to Garvey, which he does deserve credit for the work that he did. But he was standing on the shoulders of these giants as well.
Yeah. He was responding to their call.
He was responding adequately to their call. I mean, he was a student of Edward Wilmot Blyden. So you're talking about context. And as young African people, as we start to, Garvey did not exist in a vacuum. He came from a tradition, a legacy that was born in Liberia. That is why he wanted to return to Liberia. That is why Garvey set his sights on Liberia, because that is the home of his mentors. That was the home of his ideology.
That is profound. So now it became ex-President Warner. Since the foregoing was penned, intelligence has been received of the sudden death at Monrovia, December 1, of Honorable Daniel B. Warner, born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1815, immigrated to Africa in 1823, an agent of the Society in Liberia since July 1, 1877. Admiring the varied gifts with which Mr. Warner was endowed, and the long series of valuable services which he rendered, notably as Secretary of State, Vice President, and President of Liberia, and contemplating the beauty of his private life and the pure principles which guided his public conduct, the Society unites with the citizens of the new republic in sympathetic sorrow for the great national loss which it has been called upon to bear. So long as Liberia shall be known, the name of Daniel Bashiel Warner shall live.
So that is how the white elite honored him in his death. That was the word of those who were financing the American Colonization Society. This was a giant. This was a giant of our history, and our children should learn about him more than his name in a rhyme with a beat. They should know who he is and what he did. I mean, we learn about Kwame Nkrumah and people whose movement was birthed under our feet, and we don't know this. That's a tragedy.
Yeah. It is indeed sad. So yeah, this is what I remember, right? I passed by this place. So Daniel B. Warner's grave is at the corner of Warren Street and Camp Johnson Road. Yes, I remember seeing this, passing by this when it was cool.
Yeah. So that's the deplorable state of his final resting place. I mean, there's a deplorable state of many people's final resting places. You know, the main cemetery in town is even worse off than this, right?
Yeah.
But under this slab, under this dilapidated slab in this field, is a giant. One of the founders of Pan-African thought. This is how he's disrespected, you know, in Liberia. And it's, again, not because anyone wants to disrespect him. It's because people are told that these people did nothing. People are told that these people were just, you know, a bunch of slaves that came, they were just dumped here, and they came and they made us carry chamber bucket, and so we should spit on their graves. That's not an accident, that's intentional. And, you know, it is exactly how they cause Africans to implode upon themselves. Is you make your heroes, they vilify your heroes, and then you end up harming yourself. You fight yourself, you fight your reflection in the mirror. You decapitate the giant whose shoulders you're standing on. And when those trees fall, we all fall with them.
Yeah.
And so we have to tell these stories. We have to tell them truthfully.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is how I want to end. I really
And
want
to. We say rest in peace, Comrade Daniel B. Warner. Rest in peace. Oh, let's read a few comments here. Yes, Spencer was asking if Spencer was asking, I believe is in the night in Liberia. So I don't know, Spencer, if you mean, or the people are sleeping, so this is, maybe they are not listening. Yes, it's after midnight in Liberia, and we this is also on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and other social media platform. They can go there and watch that. Sekou say exactly, because if self-governance worked in Liberia, imagine where else could it work? People might be curious. Vivian, when Vivian looked at the picture, say, why were they changing the picture? When she got the explanation, say, wow, wickedness started in Liberia a long time ago. Anna Otimo, does Cisco intend to go into detail about the real identities of our past president at a later date? I don't know what real identity is, but we are going through our presidents. We started with Joseph Jenkins Roberts. We are on the third president now, Daniel B. Warner. And we may not even be able to provide maybe 0.01% of what they did, their life story. But this is a starting point.
Yeah.
Keep following the History Channel. Sekou say Edward Blyden was the man. Then exactly, then Liberia should be at the center of Pan-Africanism, but yet we have become small and small in the broader scheme of things. He continued, Garvey writes passionately about Blyden. Liberia should be a historical mecca for Pan-Africanism.
Exactly.
Yeah, or historical Jerusalem.
Right.
And then if you have to come to my town, which is Dudwiken, or the historical Dudwiken, because this is where you go for everything.
So let me just, before you read the next comment, let me say something to what Sekou said. It's amusing to me to watch Ghana, which got all of its inspiration from Liberia to exist, its existence, position itself as the Liberia of the 21st century. And we do bicentennials, we're not even thorough enough to know that the Elizabeth didn't land at Providence Island. We have to respect ourselves. Respect our history enough to do a thorough job. We tried to invite the world to Liberia. We couldn't even get our own history straight. It was sad.
Right. Because we are always in a hurry to do something, right? Maybe because of
laziness. It's lazy, and everything is about, who's going to get paid and who's going to eat money at our chopping time, and nobody wants to take anything seriously, and they don't believe that there's anything to study. So everything's very superficial, and it was a missed opportunity not to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Liberia, because it is not the 200th anniversary of Liberia, but to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the establishment of the settlement at Cape Mesurado. That is a very huge milestone. But Liberia will be 200 years old in 2047.
Liberian powerhouse, all the president graves are in a complete horrible condition.
Yes.
He said in that, I wouldn't say that a very low-minded country.
Ooh. I mean, even our ancient ruins, the walls at Wiala. I mean, we've got in the rainforest buried walled cities that were charred and burned, during the wars of Wuslu and the Rolling Wars, that could be preserved as historical sites. And there's jungle has grown over them. Nobody cares, and we just carry on. Hunters go into fields and tell stories of these things all the time. Our history is rotting away in the rainforest, even in the urban centers, and we don't do anything about it.
Yeah, you're talking about Oslo and all the empire, right? But right in Monrovia, our reporter in Monrovia did a tour of Hotel Africa in ruins, the E.J. Royce in ruins, Unity Conference Center in ruins. So all those are lying there. So Sekou say, I went to school in Liberia up to high school, and I learned nothing about Daniel B. Warner. Nothing. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Sekou, for watching. Show called The Present Indigenous have become very racist in that country and continue to tell their illiterate people that this president did absolutely nothing. And it's not just president, right? In fact, I heard a presentation where someone was, what I saw as disparaging people that we even saw and learned from, like Dr. Sawyer, Dr. Famule, Dr. Tipote, Che Chipo, Oscar Kuya, Marcus Matthew, and people just tear them apart like nothing they did, right? And so it's not just presidents. We do. In fact, someone told me, saw me that I was an old man and all of us did nothing. And that's, I don't know where that comes from, but it's
I know where it comes from. I
yeah,
know where
where?
it comes from. I know where it comes from. That is intentional conditioning. They've intentionally conditioned people to hate their reflection in the mirror. And everything about Liberia is bad. Break their self-esteem, break their sense of self-determination, bury all their giants under a mountain of lies. And so if you hate everybody that brought about all of the good things that we enjoy sovereignty, we won't feel like we need to do anything. We'll settle for anything because we'll feel that nothing's ever been done.
Right. And there is nothing to protect, right? And during the war, I lived through the war, then that's what I saw, right? People going and even shooting light poles because it's like this country is so bad. There is nothing here. Let's just destroy everything, and maybe one day, magically, we may rebuild it because there's nothing here to protect. There's nothing to preserve,
Yeah, that's the
and there
mindset.
is nothing to hold on to.
Yeah.
Sad. All right, Carl. Thank you so much. We have our call numbers here: 605-313-6004. The code is 791403. If you want to join, we have like 8 minutes to close. If you want to join the conversation, just call quickly and we'll be able to take your calls. Vivian said the mindset of people is terrible. And we hope shows like this will be able to do something towards that so that we can start looking at Liberia in another way and be able to see what little contribution we can make to be able to change the narrative. Carl will go to the next president the next time we will be here. Give us a little preview. And what we have done also is instead of coming here every weekend, we are now on every other weekend. That is every other Saturday.
Right.
The research is tough. There's a lot to look at, and we also need your support. This is civic education for our country. And if you think that whatever you can do, you can support, let's say this can turn into a university, let me put it that way. But we need your support to be able to continue, to be able to, research is not free,
Exactly.
And besides that, on top of your 9 to 5 and your family time, taking up time needs all the support that we can get.
Yeah. So the next president we're going to cover is James Briggs Payne, the president, the fourth president, who the airport is named after, who in fact was of European and African ancestry. So we will talk about James Briggs Payne, and what he did, and his accomplishments, and also why and how he became president. And it's I think important to mention. So please watch that as well. His vice president was Beverly Page Yates, who was a full-blooded African, and James Briggs Payne was of European and African ancestry. Now, I also want to show a photo of Mr. Priest, the vice president of Liberia, James M. Priest. Let me send this to you, Dennis. I think that's important. Um, do you have any callers coming in? I could just send it while you're doing that. Dennis?
Yeah, the color hanker. We got a color, but the color hanker so we can close.
All right. So let me just send this quick picture of James Priest. The reason I want you to see James Priest, I think for me, just the visuals and looking at them. James Priest looks like he could have been, he was from Sino. He looks like he could have been, in Ganta, at that time, or or Buchanan or anywhere else. He was definitely He was definitely, another full-blooded African. So James Priest was Daniel Warner's vice president. Daniel chose him as a VP. He was a judge, uh, and he was highly educated, extremely uh, good lawmaker. He wrote laws, he drafted laws, he understood legislation. These guys were extremely competent. We're not talking about people pretending to govern. We're talking about people who took the business of governing extremely seriously. And if you look at our early laws and the cases and the meticulous attention to detail, you read their letters, their correspondence, you see no typos. You see no typos, even in the Liberia Herald newspaper. You pull up articles from 150 years ago, there's no typos. I can't even read through a modern newspaper without seeing this. And it's because they had on their shoulders the burden of carrying the continent of Africa to freedom. That's how they saw the responsibility. So they took everything they did seriously. We need to get back to that. We don't need to wait for somebody to become president for us to start to think of ourselves as self-determinant human beings. We talk about these people, we talk about the past, not because we want to live there, not because they were better than us, but hopefully it will inspire us to do more than what we're doing today. Did you get the picture?
Yes. Okay. So you're talking about doing better, right? It's, you can't see, you can't read anywhere without going through a typo.
Right.
I mean, I don't know if you realize how profound that is, and these are all materials. What is
Yeah. I
I mean,
mean, James Priest, you see stuff James Priest wrote. You see things that Stephen Allen Benson wrote, letters. And you're like, wait a minute. Then you got modern, like, oh, the people that are a bunch of slaves, they didn't know anything. But you can't even compose like them. They were so these pre-20th century people were so profoundly enlightened and driven and determined and fearless. As we progress into the 20th century, you'll start to see how there's a shift and how the Liberian presidents kind of start to really, there's a period of degeneration that occurs after colonialism and the influx of European missionaries, making sure that they're teaching people that they're not supposed to be great, and they believe it. So the period of miseducation occurs in the early 20th century. But that's that Pape. That's him. That's Mr. Priest. I mean, no nonsense guy. These are the giants whose shoulders we stand upon. These are African men. These are our people. You cannot be people. You hear these guys that, like, remember they say they're Pan-Africanists, they're running around here. You cannot be African, hate African people, and be a Pan-Africanist at the same time. You cannot be African, hate African people, and love yourself at the same time. You can't be a Pan-Africanist and demonize these people. They created the ideology you're standing on. Pan-Africanism wasn't born of us indigenous people. We didn't know what it was to be African. My ancestors didn't call themselves Africans. They were my people. And the Gil were the Don were the enemy. You understand? So we must understand that the reason there's an ideology of unity in the first place is because people were subjugated in a foreign land and they were forced to have to think of themselves differently.
and call somebody is supporting what he said today. Our official government dog from the Commerce Ministry can list subsidy has subside, talking about standards. So he said the official press release from the Commerce Ministry did not spell subsidy correctly.
And again, if you miseducate, we'll get into it. Follow this series. As we talk about the presidents, we're going to follow the timeline and we're going to get to the crossroads and we're going to see where Liberia took the wrong turn. There's a few wrong turns that were taken, but we'll see where that first major wrong turn was taken. We'll see who did it and some of the rationale for it. But history has the answers. It's not a mystery. So we will get there. We'll see where we'll get to that fork in the road, and we'll see where someone went left when they should have gone right.
Thank you, Carl. Someone is asking, Viren is asking how you can support the show. Well, we have you can send us money through PayPal, or if you look at the ticker at the bottom there, we have our Cash App and Zelle information. You can also do that. You can donate. You can link us with sources. If we can even raise $100,000 to build a resource center in Monrovia where people can go and access this information, both print, digital, and whatever way that we can do that, and have an actual series so you can have calls sitting in front of you in Monrovia and delivering the same lectures here. We can do that with all your support, but drop us a line, focusonlibera@gmail, or give us a call. You see the numbers are on there. Carl, thank you so much. I want to thank our viewers for being here. Your closing comments, and we can draw down the curtains.
James Briggs Payne in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks, come here and watch James Briggs Payne. And we always, before we end, we play our song that says, "We are all Liberians." Whether you are Krao, or you are Kua, Ma, De, or you are recaptured African, or the descendant of recaptured Africans or repatriated Africans, we are all Liberians. And let us do whatever it takes to make our country the glorious land of liberty. The sweet Liberia we always talk about, we can do it. Good night, right, and have a godly night.
We are Liberians.